Hello and welcome back to the live series podcast brought to you by Amicus. This is the podcast that brings you insight into the life and role of tech leaders from all over the world. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Max Brenssell. He's co-founder and CEO over at Spoke.ai. Welcome. Thanks for your time, Max. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Perfect. I've been pretty excited to have you on. I think Spoke AI is a really interesting concept. But before we kind of get to that, do you want to just maybe for people who haven't heard of yourself or any of your work, just kind of walk us through your experience in tech up to now?
Yeah, cool. Happy to. So I'm originally from Germany, and then after living abroad, moved back to Berlin in 2016. Had my first startup experience here, joined N26 in the fintech industry. Back then it was fairly early stage, around Series A, 60 people in the team. I spent 3 years there, saw the team grow to more than 1,500 people, I believe, and worked across international expansion and strategic projects for international markets. And then back then first got a taste for working in a startup and with technology in the B2C setting back then, but still was a very cool start for me. And then after that, spent some time in the micromobility industry as well, which similarly was B2C software driven, but also had a more of a hardware and operations component, which was an interesting time. And then after that, during COVID, started to build my first own company.
Yeah, it's an incredible amount of kind of expansion that you've overseen, isn't it, in your career? Excuse me. I know when we were chatting before, we kind of, as soon as you said that you'd seen it grow to over 1,000, I was like, right, we've got to talk about that because that's just unrivaled experience, I think, for any kind of leader. So walk me through about Spoke.ai then. Tell us about that for anyone that's not heard of it.
Yeah, happy to. So the idea for Spoke actually originated from myself and my co-founders, team members, being part of fast scaling teams and always suffering from information overload, drowning in messages, trying to work and manage communication across different tools. And so what we're building with Spoke, in essence, is AI-based summarization and using AI to distill and summarize communication that's happening across different tools, and also prioritize the work that's happening across these different tools with the help of AI to save our users time at the end of the day.
Sure, it's a really great concept, and especially when you, as someone who you've just said has literally come from that, you've kind of seen a dilemma, you've experienced that exact dilemma, and then you've gone and created your own solution, which is very impressive. And that applies across, it's company wide as well, isn't it, Spoke? It's not just something that is specific to tech teams and things like that. And so it's pretty it's a pretty impressive idea, to be honest. Talk me through a little bit then with you saying that obviously you saw that much expansion and at Spoke, like how big is the team? Like how, obviously you don't necessarily have to have a huge, enormous company, especially someone your experience who has already obviously managed a vast amount of people and a varied amount of team members. So just walk me through kind of a little bit of the background about how Spoke functions and kind of a little bit about the teams and more detail there.
Yeah, happy to. So we're headquartered in Berlin. We're today 17, including myself and my two co-founders, Jack and Carl. And then half of our team roughly is in Berlin and the other half is distributed across Europe and Africa. So we have, I think, total, we have people in 8 different countries, but from 13 or 14 different nationalities.
Yeah, so it's a very global function that's going on over there. It's again, it's very impressive. One thing I would like to talk about is inclusivity. And when we chatted a little bit before, you mentioned about having an inclusive team and a diverse team is important in any company, but when you're dealing with AI, it's exceptionally important, isn't it? How did you kind of approach that? What have your efforts been up to now with that side of things?
Yeah, it's a super important topic for us and one that we care about a lot. I think the background there is that in the past, when we were part of fast-growing teams, we've always seen that it can require, if you don't get it right from the beginning, it can require a major effort and correction to get your team to a place where you have more diversity. And because it's sort of this self-fulfilling prophecy, that's what we always thought. If you start to have a diverse team from the beginning, then obviously in turn it's much easier to attract more diverse candidates and so on and so forth. So what we did initially, before we started hiring, our goal from the beginning was to have a very diverse team. So we set specifically the goal of having at least 50% of the team non-male identifying, which of course is not the perfect measure or KPI for diversity, but it felt like a good proxy and a concrete goal for us to reach. And yeah, basically we set out when we started hiring the first team members always with this goal in mind, and so far managed to stick to that as well.
Yeah, I know what you're saying, a 50-50 split. In a perfect world, it wouldn't matter that much about what the percentage is, because we wouldn't have a kind of lack of diversity in tech. But I think you're right. I think 50% split's a good benchmark, especially for any startup. And so that, like you touched a little bit on kind of the consequences of not having a diverse team and how much they're even more kind of impactful when it comes to AI. Is that something that you've seen elsewhere, or is that just something that you were kind of aware of and wanted to avoid with Spoke?
I think we've seen it ourselves in the past. And obviously for us now, it's a very extreme case because we're building an AI product and we're building for a global market because our product is language-based. So unlike fintech, for example, we don't have to get a license for every market that we go into, but rather from the beginning, we're addressing a very diverse audience of potential users. And that's why it was so important for us to also have that reflected within our own team, because with regards to building AI specifically, having certain, or not being able to detect, for example, certain biases in your training data, to give a concrete example, can lead to suboptimal outcomes in terms of how your models then work and the output that you serve to your users, which in our case is summaries, right? Might then have certain biases that then negatively impact the experience for some users, which I might not realize, but someone else on my team who maybe speaks a different language, comes from a different country, etc., would catch. So that's why, in particular for AI companies, I think even more so than for other companies, it's super important to think about diversity and inclusivity in terms of the final outcome and the user experience that you're building.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? You don't want kind of three people with a similar mindset starting a company and then it not only working for people with the exact same mindset everywhere in the world. It's just not a practical thing. And it's interesting to hear that you've seen it elsewhere as well, the consequences of that as well. And it's kind of something that almost sounds like an obvious thing to want to think about, but people actually implementing that, and it sounds like you're doing a really good job of it, to be honest, as well. So in terms of, I know you said you've kind of got that 50% benchmark for yourselves. How is that going? And how would you kind of say your team represents your aims with diversity?
Yeah, I think right now we're more than 50% non-male identifying. I think it's also important though to keep this benchmark in mind across, for example, maybe different levels of hierarchy you might have in your team, right? So you obviously also want your leadership team, for example, to be sufficiently diverse. So yeah, we're right now hitting that benchmark, which is super exciting for us, I think. So we're quite happy with that. But I think it also there's also a couple of other things that we try to get right, that kind of go hand in hand with this. So for example, having very clear outline of remote first etiquette and what that means in terms of how you communicate across different channels, how asynchronous versus synchronous communication should work so that it feels inclusive, no matter if someone's sitting, for example, in Berlin or in Lagos, Nigeria. I think that's an important one. And then the other two areas that we thought about from the beginning are kind of the having a code of conduct internally, just to codify how we want to behave as a group and kind of interact with each other, and our general kind of working policy and making that quite flexible in terms of where you work from, what hours you work, etc., to be more inclusive, for example, for colleagues that might have different family setup, children, etc.
Yeah, I think you've got a lot to juggle, haven't you? Especially if you're remote and you're global and it's communication, and it's AI, and you need to be diverse, and you're actually making a communications product. So if you're not getting your own principles right in that sense, then your product's gonna suffer, isn't it? So you've definitely given yourself a lot of work to do. But it sounds like a really good function that you have over there. So let's talk about your efforts in just to go back to the diversity kind of side of things at Spoke. It's the $1 million question, isn't it? How do you source candidates to make sure that you're kind of hitting your targets with diversity, and without making it sound like you're trying to tick boxes necessarily, because I don't think that that's obviously the way that you guys are doing it over there. It's interesting as well that you mentioned about leadership, because I think that obviously lends itself to being able to hire more diverse candidates as well. If somebody, or if people in the company are already kind of representing minorities and not necessarily, a clean slate of people. So just talk me through like kind of how you go about hiring and sourcing like those candidates for diversity.
Yeah, happy to. So by now we're luckily in a position where we also get a lot of inbound applications. This obviously hasn't always been the case, and especially when you're just starting up, I think the key for us was to really experiment a lot, like with all things as an early stage startup. So what we did is we really tested a lot of different sources to finding candidates, right? From your classic kind of like LinkedIn angel list, also to working with recruiters, and then specifically briefing them around what you think you would like to add to the team, and how you understand diversity and what that means, and what potential candidates should look like and bring. And so I think really trying many different sources for different job boards. There's now also very specialized job boards for product managers, for designers, etc. So going into those different kind of niche channels and just experimenting was really, really important for us. And then in the end, luckily got us a very, very diverse group of applicants for most of the positions that we looked like, that we were looking for, which were mostly very technical to this point, which historically I think makes it more difficult to find fewer male and more diverse candidates.
Yeah, I mean, excuse me, just based on kind of what I hear in the office between consultants and things like that, it's almost kind of, if you get, say, I don't know, a female engineer come across, it's kind of like there's at least 5 or 6 jobs on that people kind of want to interview them for, and it can be a scarce market, can't it, at times? So but it sounds like you guys are nailing it. So when you've got all these candidates, what does your interview process then look like to kind of encourage that diversity and to make sure that your interview process is just as inclusive?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I would mention is that as an early stage startup, we try to be fast. I think this is one of the main advantages that we have when we compete with large established companies for talent. So we try, in an ideal case, we can get from first call to offer in a week, which is usually then faster than our more established competitors. And the process, we try to keep it pretty lean, but the principles that we follow is that we don't require any cover letters or anything like that. So you just apply with your CV and your GitHub profile or your existing portfolio if you're a designer, for example. But we don't make you sit down and write a cover letter. I think there's not really any point to that, especially not now with all the AI tools available. And then what we do is a couple of calls. We do a first screening call, which is done by one of the co-founders, typically depending on the role. That usually lasts 30 minutes and is really about kind of culture add, as we like to call it. So not culture fit, but really thinking about what can this person add to the team that's maybe not represented yet, and are they generally a nice human being? And then that's the first step. And then the next steps are typically a technical call. So this depends on the role, but for engineers, for example, it's a 60-minute technical discussion with 1 or 2 team members. Again, there we don't make people do a coding challenge because we think that in many cases this is a little bit antiquated. And again, can be solved by ChatGPT in most cases. And then following the technical call, if that goes well, we do a team call where the candidate then within 1 hour meets 2 or 3 other team members as well, usually from other teams that they would be working with. So for example, an engineer would then meet someone from design and from the data team. And then if that goes well, we do a final founder call, which is usually around 45 minutes, where the candidate then speaks to the 2 other co-founders that they haven't met yet in the very first call.
Yeah, it sounds like a really well-rounded process, to be honest. And I like what you were saying there about like no tech tests and also no cover letters. These are usually kind of the most time-consuming elements of an interview process, aren't they? And I think you're right about cover letters. I don't think, especially again when I hear around in the office, I don't hear any consultants saying, oh, they didn't put a cover letter down so they can't have an interview. It's just not really a case anymore, is it? Especially in tech, I would say, you know, you're not interested really of how charismatic they seem on paper. Like, you can just meet them in person, or you can, like you said, just look at the GitHub or something. It's very simple. And I think that's great. I think that's really cool. And like you said, with speed as well against the bigger competitors, that's such a good shout also. Like, you know, I think especially with the market the way it is, people do kind of want a quick turnaround, and they, you know, and especially with all developers are pretty much in demand all the time. So getting the right one, you kind of need to do it quickly, because otherwise they're going to lose interest and go somewhere else. And it's because they know that it's pretty much guaranteed a lot of the time if they're an exceptional talent. So I know you kind of just walked me through your hiring process there, and my next question was going to be kind of like, what is your ideal hiring process? But presumably that's the same one that you've crafted yourself. What kind of, just for anyone listening who's kind of listening to maybe understand more about how they can bring more diversity onto their team, for example, like how would you say, or what kind of no-nos or red flags in a hiring process do you think would exclude people who, you know, maybe would be looking to join a team and someone would want to hire them, again, not to tick boxes, but because they want more diverse representation?
Yeah.
And something in their hiring process puts them off. Like what would you say that could be?
Yeah, so I think the key kind of principle that we look at is really this culture add idea. So no matter how big your team already is or who's already in your team, you can always think about what are some things that are not represented here yet, right? And this could be someone from a different country, ethnicity, speaking a different language, having lived in different countries, having worked in different types of companies before. So really having that as your guiding principle rather than culture fit, which then in the end can result in just having 20 people that are exactly the same and have the same background. So I think that's the most important. And then the other things that we look for, which I think also help contribute to an inclusive and diverse work environment, are sort of, is the candidate very kind of reflective and humble, so willing to learn and willing to learn from others as well, right? So I think this is super important and can really help foster a more kind of inclusive and collaborative work environment.
Yeah, I think those are great points as well. And it kind of all comes back down to kind of making yourself come across as what you actually are. There's only so much kind of, not pretending, but there's only so many things you can do to make your company look a certain way to a star candidate until they actually clock on and realize you're actually not as diverse or you're not as inclusive as you're kind of letting on. So having those principles in place genuinely is super important. I totally agree with you. Let's talk about kind of women in tech for a sec, because I know you said that you have like a non-male identifying percentage in your company, and that's really brilliant. What do you think? Obviously, it's not a hidden fact that there is a lack of women in tech. What do you think kind of can be? It's a very vague question, but what do you kind of think can be done from maybe people in your position or from anybody kind of just listening who's in tech in some sort of role? What can be done to raise the confidence of women in tech?
Yeah, I think that's a very big challenge still, right? And obviously an ongoing one. I think what we've seen work well and what we try to support is specific events, like for example, Women in AI. There's lots of different formats that are happening, right? And we try to support those by encouraging our existing team members to use that, obviously to first and foremost talk about diversity in AI, in tech, etc. Not so much to just talk about Spoke and us. So that's I think that's one thing that we try to support with these events. And then the second one is around our own channels, right? And the content we put out and encouraging our team members to become thought leaders in certain areas, to share, for example, challenges that they face. We run one initiative that's called Documenting in Public, for example, where we just publish some of our internal documentation around challenges that people work on and then solve or fail to solve, but learn something from it. So just encouraging people to authentically kind of share about learnings, challenges, etc., I think can be very encouraging. And obviously, if that's also women sharing and that are already in certain roles, I think that they can serve as role models to aspiring data scientists, engineers, etc.
Mm-hmm. Do you have, I know you mentioned earlier about you do make sure that your kind of leadership, as well as the team on a whole, kind of hit that benchmark of your diversity and inclusion targets? Like, do you find a lot of more like women junior engineers, or do you kind of find them more women at entry level? I only asked that because I had a really amazing guest on a few weeks ago, Leah Cohen, and she actually was talking about women on entry level, and a lot of the time women have kind of made a complete career change to get into tech, as opposed to not, you know, it's not factually like massively accurate, like in terms of, I don't have the numbers for you, but definitely I think more women would have a career change, or tech isn't necessarily their first career option in a lot of cases. Do you find that, or is it kind of, do you kind of select kind of certain people with certain backgrounds or anything like that when it comes to their entry level and where they're coming into your company, what position they're coming into and things like that?
Yeah, good question. I would say that probably our sample size in terms of just our team size and the number of applicants that we see is probably too small. But looking at our team, there's probably a slight bias towards women having slightly less work experience, which might be because it's just a more recent kind of phenomenon that more women go into tech. I don't have any data on it, but I think
no, that's fine.
Sense.
I know I kind of put you on the spot a little bit there and threw that one out there for you, but I just think it's a very interesting kind of ongoing conversation. So it's good to get kind of a tech leader's input on that. So I just thought I'd take my opportunity, but it's definitely an ongoing conversation, I think, and it's interesting to hear what people have to say about it. So I can't believe that we've already kind of come towards the end of the episode. I think it's definitely an episode that I could probably get a good 3 or 4 more hours out of. But in terms of my sort of penultimate question, and it's a question that I always ask my guests, it's what would you describe yourself how would you describe yourself as a leader in 3 words?
Yeah, I think that's not an easy question to answer. I think what I would say is like how I would like to be perceived by others is as pragmatic, transparent, and loyal.
Yeah, transparency comes up a lot. I think that's a really brilliant one as any leader in any industry. I think transparency and loyalty as well. Like when you say loyalty, do you mean kind of in terms of your team being able to trust you, or is it kind of, you know, you sticking up for your team, or is that a kind of co-founder's attitude as well? Like what would you mean when you say loyal?
Yeah, I think definitely building relationships over time, investing in relationships with team members, supporting them when they face some more difficult time for whatever reason, be it professionally or personally, because I think that investing in those kinds of relationships long term really pays off a lot.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant response. I wasn't trying to quiz you there on what you meant. I just thought it was very interesting. I don't think anyone said loyal before, but it's absolutely right. It's a very, very good quality to have as any leader, isn't it? So on to my final kind of question then for you, and again, it's one that I ask a lot, but I think you're the first person who's kind of been on the show who's founded an AI company, which is quite interesting, and also who has had to sort of deal with the diversity side of AI. I think that's a really interesting, fairly niche subject that I'd definitely love to get you back on maybe in 6 months' time, and we see how Spoke.ai is going, and see if you're still hitting that 50% benchmark as well. That'd be really cool. But my last sort of question is what advice would you have for someone looking to either found their own company, or someone looking to get into AI, or just generally somebody in your position?
Yeah, that's a great question, I think. I mean, with the kind of recent hype in AI, obviously things are developing very, very quickly, and there's new ideas, new tools every day, etc. So what I would say as an advice is to, when you found a company or start building a team, just make yourself aware that building any company, I think, in 99.9% of the cases really takes a lot of time. So you're thinking about probably the next 10 years of your life. So really think about who you want to be spending that time with, and make sure that those are people that you really want to spend a lot of time with in the next couple of years. Because I think in our society today, we obviously have a lot of biases in terms of we only hear about these overnight success stories, etc. And then if you do some digging, even most of those success stories actually took 5 to 10 years to build. So yeah, just be aware of that time scale and make sure you find the right people to go on that journey with.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. That's really, really good advice, isn't it? And I think the practicality of founding is often overlooked. Like you say, you're right, with the overnight success stories, left, right, and center. You're absolutely right. Honestly, Max, thank you so much for your time. I wasn't lying when I said I think we could definitely get a few more episodes out of diversity in AI. I think it's a really fascinating subject and one that's only going to develop over time as well. So, yeah, thank you so much for your time today. It's been lovely.
Thanks for having me.
No, that's lovely. So if you're watching on YouTube, you can hover over the logo in the corner just there, or it might be that side. I never get that right. And you can just go ahead and hit subscribe to see all the rest of our episodes and future ones as well. You can follow us on social media at Amicus Jobs and head over to our website, amicusjobs.com, for tech news, webinars, blogs, and keep up to date with all the latest Python, Golang, JavaScript, machine learning, and Rust roles everywhere. We recently expanded our technologies, so that is such a mouthful now to say. Thank you again so much, Max. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on.
Thank you.